Good morning and welcome to ASL's HR in 10.
At 10.
I'm Jason Perry
And I'm Kimberly Bradshaw.
and we're going to bring you up to date with what's going on in the wonderful world of employment law and HR. So, Kimberly, last week you and I talked about don't rush out of lockdown, didn't we?
We did indeed. You heard it first here.
Indeed. I think the CIPD were watching us.
Obviously.
I noticed that I think it's the Chief Policy Advisor at CIPD now, despite Boris's best advice of everybody rush back to the office, it's kind of saying slow down a little, isn't he?
Yes. Although we know that things are changing, we don't know what's around the corner, and we need to be braced and ready in case there's another variant that isn't as smooth as the current one. What he's advising basically is to do it a bit by bit, baby steps, as we were talking about last week.
Absolutely. It's interesting because I noticed yesterday Sainsbury's have said from a retail perspective, and I think as have John Lewis and obviously Waitrose, that they would like to keep face masks in store. And the other big one is the train companies. You know, this big return to the office, which I understand the intention was to restart city economies. But the big return to the office, the trains aren't putting on extra services for them, are they?
No, they're not. And I'm not quite certain, no longer being a commuter into London, I don't know what the train services are these days, but I would assume that they've got a reduced service on. But, there also might be a lot of companies who have stuck with the hybrid working. So people are only in a couple of days. So overall, it reduces the number of people on a train.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch. I mean, the advice from the CIPD really does follow from what we were saying last week of don't rush this, take gentle steps. And I think there's a really big point. As I start saying those words, I start thinking, here we go again. But it's the thing you and I always talk about. You need to carry your people with you, don't you?
Yeah.
Employee engagement.
Yeah, exactly. Excuse me, win the hearts and minds of everybody. Get them involved so that,
Yes.
We've been talking to people, haven't we, where there's been employers are concerned about coming back, and you've got to involve them in the process, engage them, get their views, and demonstrate how safe you're doing. And we know from some of the local employers that excuse me, are still going to go way above and beyond the requirements to protect their staff.
Yes, yeah. I'm going to jump completely sideways for a minute because on that point, there was a really interesting tribunal we talked about a bit yesterday, but I forget the name, but it was a lady that worked in a pet, I think a pet food retailer, a pet shop.
Yeah.
And by normal measures, she had no employment rights because she was less than 2 years service and working on a 0 hours contract. And it's exactly that point. She was hugely concerned about the COVID policies and keeping people safe. And on the basis of her concerns, she was a whistleblower. They didn't take it seriously and they fired her, didn't they?
They did indeed. And, as you've just pointed out, the key point there being they didn't follow an appropriate process that was at ACAS standards or above.
Yes. And there was no employee engagement. This key point, you have to bring your people with you. And it's no good just having one of the workers, shall we say, disapproved by other colleagues because of their view and having some kind of mob rule. You have to bring people together and get them to understand why you're doing what you're doing, get them to support what you're doing and actually gain some kind of consensus.
Absolutely.
That's what we call leadership, really, isn't it?
Yes.
Shall we move on a little bit? What should we talk about next? There's loads going on.
I want to chuckle about the research that said that we're all being kinder after COVID. Um, it was AXA, I think, did the research, didn't they? And apparently, from that, a half of workers said that they are kinder to their colleagues than they were at the start of the pandemic.
I'm sure you were always kind, Kimberly.
Mm, I try to be, yes. You know what it's like. Sometimes our job is, you have to be pretty tough. Um, but, I'm thinking, is that actually right? Certainly, my personal experience in the early stages of the pandemic were that people were more considerate and, supported each other. Is that still happening? I'm not certain.
Do you know, there's some interesting points because a little like that tribunal we just mentioned, in that case, her colleagues were really unimpressed that she was saying, wear your mask, wash your hands,
Yeah.
whatever these things were. And they weren't at all kind towards her, and that was why she was fired. But generally, I would say there has been a much greater awareness of people's struggles, of
Yeah.
mental health issues.
Yeah.
So we've seen a much larger number of people in society, in employment, comment on their own fragility and say, I'm not coping very well this week.
Yes, I think it was about 60% said that there's been a destigmatisation of
Yes.
mental health, and
Yeah.
people are more willing to talk about it, share it, and I think that is an absolute positive. It's one of my bandwagons,
Yes.
as you know.
Yes.
And if people, I just hope that as places open up again, that doesn't reduce again. I hope it
Yes.
keeps moving forward.
But I think in that sense, I can see the argument that we have become kinder, if that's the right word. We've become a little more understanding of other people's difficulties.
Yeah.
And I suppose in that sense we have. And I said right at the beginning of this, it's slightly scary, it's pretty much 2 years ago, that this is a little bit like going into the Second World War. We have to view this differently and pull together. And I think there is an extent to which that has happened, and people have become more tolerant of how others are coping and supportive of each other in that. So I can kind of see where they're going, I think.
Yes, definitely. And also having a good line manager is very important in that. I think those that have struggled, my views on this, but those that have struggled to remotely manage effectively will be the ones most calling for people to come back rather than having adapted their own style of line management.
Yes, it's working out how you do that and come back. I'm looking at the time and I'm thinking, I think we've got time just to squeeze in that really important tribunal.
Yes, Scarsdale Nursing Home.
Indeed.
Is that what it was called?
Indeed, I think you've got that one right. But what fascinated me about this one is about a year before the government made vaccines mandatory in the care sector, even before anyone was talking about vaccines being mandatory. In December 2020, this lady with, I think, something like 14 years service was told that she needed to have the vaccine to continue working in her care job. And when she declined it, she was fired.
She was. And also, there was no mention of religious or pharmaceutical concerns. No. And for their view was that they were suspending her because of the safety of their patients.
Indeed, and also worth stressing, we talk about some areas where there are doctors that have contractually an obligation to have certain vaccines. There's nothing in her contract of employment that said the employer had the right to do this. But as you say, they decided for the safety of their patients that this was a business requirement. And there was even an insurance issue there, but they followed it. They had every procedure spot on. They followed a process. They communicated. They explained the consequences to her. They tried to support her but she had a belief that governments were lying to us, that vaccines were unsafe. And they couldn't help her past it, could they?
No, they couldn't. But I think what then emerged was that she had Rastafarian beliefs,
Yes.
and I think she tried to argue her point on the basis of that. But nobody, her colleagues, employers, nobody had any awareness of her
No, no.
Rastafarian beliefs before that.
Yeah. But I think because they tried to support and they followed due process at each point, the really interesting thing is the tribunal found on the side of the employer, which was not necessarily what most of us would have expected in that. And the line is they pursued a reasonable business procedure. They had reasonable business reasons for wanting her to have the vaccine. She declined, and she therefore declined a work management instruction. And therefore the dismissal was deemed to be fair. Now, this arguably still has to go to the Employment Appeals Tribunal, assuming it does. But it's a big landmark case, I think, isn't it?
I think it has huge ramifications, and I think this is going to be one of those cases that people use for years going forward. So, yeah,
Yes.
I'm really interested to see what's going to happen at appeal, though.
Watch this space. It does say, as an employer, if you do it for the right reason and you do it in the right way, get your processes, your HR, your employee engagement right, you can go with the no jab, no job.
Yeah.
So there we go. On that note, I think we've run out of time, Kimberly, so we shall wrap up for today. But it's been an absolute pleasure, and we will be back same time next week.
Looking forward to it.